The Eyes of the Killer Robot by John Bellairs, Chapter 6. The professor and the two boys went down to the second floor of the house, and they started going through the rooms. It didn't take them long to find out what they were looking for. In a bedroom in the northeast corner of the house, they saw the outline of a door under the faded pink wallpaper. Eagerly they went to work, ripping away the paper, and when they were through, there was an old paneled door. The knob was gone, and the keyhole was filled with putty. But when the professor gave the door a kick, it groaned and moved inward. Eddies of dust sifted down from the top of the door frame. He kicked harder, and the door flew back with a loud, alarming clatter. Behind the door lay a shallow closet, and the ladder was bolted to the back wall. At the top of the ladder, set in the ceiling, was a small trap door. "Well, well," said the professor, putting his hands on his hips. "It looks as if we have struck pay dirt. Who wants to go up first?" Fergie said that he had the right to go first, since he had been the one who noticed the window in the roof. The professor grinned and stepped back, and Fergie started to climb. When he got to the top of the ladder, he reached up and shoved at the trap door. It was loose, so Fergie gave it a hard push, and it went flying back. More dust and a stale, shut-up smell came drifting through the small square opening. Fergie climbed up another rung and poked his head into the room above. "Oh my gosh," he exclaimed in an awestruck voice. "Hey, you guys, it's up here. It really is. The robot, the whole darn thing." Johnny was overjoyed. He felt like dancing and yelling. And he could see that the professor was pretty tickled too. They were like archaeologists who had discovered King Tut's tomb. "Wonderful," crowed the professor, rubbing his hands with glee. "Byron, climb up into the room. John, you can go next if you want to." A few minutes later, all three of them were kneeling on the floor of the tiny attic room. Overhead, a thick pane of lead-colored glass let a faint light seep in. Lying in a heap against the wall were the pieces of the wonderful baseball-throwing robot. Its arms lay stacked on its headless body, and its legs stood against the wall. The wheeled platform was propped against a rafter nearby. On a little shelf stood the robot's head. It stared weirdly out into the room, but the stare was blank. The robot's eyes were gone. Humming quietly, the professor picked up one of the robot's arms and examined it. It was the cast-iron throwing arm, and it was quite heavy. "Interesting," muttered the professor. "He had the arm coated with zinc, so there really isn't much rust. I brought my toolbox with me in the car, and I'll bet I could get this silly gizmo slapped back together and in working order in no time." Fergie glanced quickly at Johnny, and Johnny winced. He knew what Fergie was thinking. The professor was always bragging about how good he was with tools, but everybody knew that he could hardly drive a nail straight. If he tried putting the robot together, they might be here in New Hampshire for a long, long time. The professor glowered. "Well, what are you two simpering and snickering about? I fixed the windshield wipers on my car the other day, and they worked for a while. Anyway, if either of you thinks he can put the robot together faster, go right ahead." Fergie gave Johnny another look and then coughed and tried to smile in a reassuring way. "Prof," he began, we know you're a real whiz with tools and all, but, well, don't you think we ought to take the pieces of this what's-a-majigger back with us in the car? We could get some car repairman to screw it back together for us. It probably wouldn't cost much, would it?" The back of the professor's neck began to get red, which was a sign that he was becoming irritated. "Gentlemen," he said in a biting tone, "I was not planning to do the whole job, reassembling the robot up here. I thought I would merely, screw the head onto the body and have a look at the machinery inside the chest cavity. Then we could carry the pieces of the robot down to my car and take it to my basement workshop at home. And I wish you two would stop giving each other funny looks. I'm a perfectly reasonable person, and I'm not all that bad with tools. Now, why don't you two help me carry the pieces of our friend here downstairs, and then I'll go get my toolbox, and we'll see what can be done, okay?" Fergie and Johnny shrugged helplessly. The professor climbed halfway down the ladder, and the boys handed pieces of the robot down to him through the trapdoor hole. Except for the cast-iron arm, the pieces were surprisingly light, and the professor remarked that the robot might be made of aluminum. "Aluminum?" said Fergie in a surprised voice. "Did they have aluminum way back then?" The professor nodded. "They did indeed. There is a statue in Piccadilly Circus in London that's made of aluminum, and that was put there in 1893. Anything else you'd like to know?" A little while later, All the pieces of the robot were lying on the grass in the field next to the house. The professor was kneeling next to the shiny metal body, and he was peering in through the little door in the man's chest. "Mercy," he said, shaking his head in despair. It looks like the night they went crazy at the clock factory. I've never seen so many gears and levers in my born days." With a sigh, he shut the metal door and stood up. "And there's another thing," he went on, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I wonder what happened to the eyes. People claimed they were extremely lifelike, made of glass, probably. Oh, well, the eyes were just ornaments, and I'm wasting time yammering on like this. You boys stay here. I'll scoot down to the car and get my toolbox, and we'll see what can be done." The professor walked off across the field, humming quietly. "Well, we found the famous gizmo," said Fergie, as soon as the professor was out of sight. "I hope the prof is happy, but I still don't see how he's going to pass this hunk of junk off as a real human being." "I don't either," said Johnny glumly. He looked down at the pieces of the robot that lay shining in the sunlight. "But he said there was this energy source that made the robot go, and maybe that's the answer. Maybe the mysterious energy source made the robot look like a real person. Could that be possible?" Fergie shrugged. "Search me. All I know is this energy source stuff sounds like a lot of garbage." "Does he think the old Whoozes came up with atomic power back in the horse and buggy days? That's kind of hard to believe." Johnny said nothing. The robot was a riddle, but he knew one thing. He would be very glad to get away from this place. The house was grim and forbidding, even in the daytime. Idly, Johnny watched a bird fly by. Then he stretched and yawned and walked around picking pieweed stalks. Fergie sat down on a rotting stump and took a harmonica out of his shirt pocket. He began to play a sad old folk tune. Johnny knew the words. "Come all you young fellows, so young and so fine, and seek not your fortune in a dark dreary mine. For 'twill form as a habit and seep in your soul, till the stream of your blood is as black as the coal. For it's dark as dungeon and damp as the dew, and sorrows are many and the pleasures are few." Fergie played on, and Johnny walked away with his bunch of flowery purple plants. He was looking for a jar or a bucket to stick them in, and he had a vague idea that there might be one out behind the house. As he walked, he began to feel very odd. It seemed to him that the air had suddenly gotten chilly, and the sound of the harmonica grew fainter, as if Fergie were playing off in some distant place. Dreamily, Johnny turned and stared at an old rusty drain pipe that ran down the backside of the house. Sure enough, there was a coffee can full of water under the drain pipe. He started to walk toward it, but he hadn't taken 2 steps when something made him turn. Not far from the back door of the house stood a bench covered with peeling white paint. It was a garden seat, the kind people used to make so they could sit outdoors on hot summer nights. The bench stood in a patch of wild rose bushes not far from the rugged wall of the mountain, which towered overhead. A man was sitting on the bench, a man Johnny had never seen before. He wore baggy, dusty overalls and a faded plaid shirt. He had a big mop of straw-colored hair. The man sat hunched over with his face in his hands. He seemed to be crying. Johnny stood dead still. The bunch of pieweed stalks fell from his numb fingers, and he took a couple of shuffling steps forward, and then, as Johnny watched, the man stood up. He took his hands away from his face, and he stumbled. Johnny gasped in terror. The man had no eyes. Streaks of blood ran down from empty black sockets. "They took my eyes," the man moaned. "They took my eyes." Johnny opened and closed his mouth and made little whimpering noises. He shut his eyes tight to block out this horrible vision, and when he opened them again, a second later, the man was gone. And that's the end of chapter 6.